History remembers Anne Boleyn as the queen who lost her head, not as the woman who may have hidden a life the crown could never acknowledge. Before her fall, before the scaffold at Tower Green, there are whispers of a secret birth concealed in the shadows of Whitehall. A child erased from records, carried away under moonlight, protected by silence and sin. Some called him a curse, others a phantom heir who doomed the Tudor bloodline. What if the true tragedy of Anne Boleyn was not her death, but the forbidden life she left behind? This is the untold story, the secret that could have destroyed a king. In the years before Anne Boleyn wore a crown, before her name became a warning whispered through English halls, she was only a woman, brilliant, ambitious, and dangerously human. The court of Henry VIII was a theater of masks and secrets, and few understood its cruel stage better than she. Behind the silken ceremony lay ambition sharpened like a blade. To rise in Tudor England was to risk one's soul, and Anne's ascent would be bought not only with blood, but with silence. In the winter of 1526, before she became Henry's obsession, Anne found herself trapped between duty and desire. The court buzzed with rumors of the king's faltering marriage and his restless eyes, but Anne's heart, restless itself, had already been claimed, not by the king, but by a man she could never publicly name. Some say it was a diplomat from France, a remnant of her years abroad. Others whisper it was a noble of Henry's own council, a man whose loyalty to the crown made their love a mortal sin. What began as fleeting glances across the hall grew into dangerous intimacy, hidden in the shadowed chapels of Greenwich. Each meeting was a gamble, every word a confession whispered against divine law. Anne knew the price of desire, yet she also knew the power it held, and perhaps, in her secret heart, she wondered if the child of such forbidden love might one day give her leverage against a king. When she first discovered her condition, Anne's world fractured. To carry a child without a husband was ruin. To carry one that bore the likeness of another man while the king's court watched her every move, that was death. She turned to her most trusted companion, a lady-in-waiting named Joan Parker, who swore an oath upon the sacrament to protect her secret. Under the guise of illness, Anne withdrew from court. Physicians were forbidden to attend her without permission. She lived those months like a ghost, unseen, unheard, yet bound to the life growing within her. It was said that thunder rolled over London the night the child came into the world. No servants were present save Joan and a midwife brought blindfolded to the chamber. The infant cried only once, a sound that silenced trembling hands. The midwife baptized him in secret, naming him Thomas, the name of Anne's long-dead brother, perhaps as an act of mourning or penance. By dawn, the child was gone. Joan carried him from the estate, hidden beneath wool in silence, never to return. Anne's body recovered, but her spirit fractured. Those who saw her afterward noted her eyes, once full of defiance, now shadowed by something deeper than guilt. When she returned to court, the king saw only beauty and ambition. He could not see what haunted her, the sin buried beneath her silks, the life erased for survival. Years later, when Henry's love for her turned to cruelty, courtiers would speak of Anne's strange prayers, her nightly tears, the way she touched her abdomen as if mourning something unseen. None knew the truth, and none dared ask. But somewhere, in the heart of England, a child of her blood still breathed, and with each breath, the quiet curse of the Boleyn line grew stronger. The boy's first breath had been taken in secrecy, his first cry swallowed by the night. In Tudor England, where royal blood dictated life or death, his very existence was an act of treason. No records bore his name. No priest dared sign his baptism. He was both living flesh and erased history, a child born not to inherit a throne, but to haunt it. Joan Parker, Anne's loyal lady-in-waiting, carried him across the fog-drenched roads toward Essex, wrapped in coarse linen rather than velvet. Her hands shook with fear at every toll bell and patrol crossing. Only one man knew her destination, Dr. Matthew Henslow, a discreet physician who had once treated Anne during her early court days. His oath to God and to Anne bound him to silence. The world would never know whose child he sheltered. At Henslow's secluded manor, the boy was hidden under the guise of an orphaned cousin. The physician's servants were forbidden to question his lineage. His name, Thomas, was spoken only in whispers. Though the midwife's blessing had been hurried and fearful, Henslow renewed it, placing a trembling cross of oil upon the infant's forehead, murmuring, "May heaven forgive what men must hide." As months passed, the boy thrived. His eyes were a deep, unsettling brown, flecked with amber, not unlike those of the king himself. It was this resemblance that terrified Henslow most. The child's smile, sharp and knowing even in infancy, carried an unspoken omen. Lady Joan would stare at him for hours, caught between love and dread. "He bears his father's pride," she once whispered, "and his mother's defiance." In the court of Henry VIII, silence was armor. But silence, too, could kill. News traveled in murmurs, in the shivering breaths of servants who saw too much. By 1528, faint rumors began to seep through the corners of London's parishes that Anne Boleyn, the king's new favorite, had once withdrawn from court for a mysterious illness, that a woman of her household had vanished soon after, that a midwife had been seen leaving the royal apartments in tears. No proof, no names, yet the whispers grew like rot beneath marble. Meanwhile, Anne's life at court blossomed. She became the king's obsession, his promised queen. But even as Henry's desire for her burned with blasphemous intensity, she felt the weight of her past pressing from the shadows. She would wake from fevered dreams, a child crying, water rising, a cradle sinking beneath the tide. Those close to her learned never to speak of children in her presence. In Essex, Thomas grew into a quiet, solemn boy. Henslow taught him to read the Psalms and to write the name Thomas, though never a surname. He spoke little, yet when he did, his words bore an unnatural gravity, as if he carried memory older than his years. There were nights when he would rise screaming, claiming to see a woman in jewels, weeping in a tower. No one dared interpret the visions. But Lady Joan, whose faith had begun to crack beneath the burden of their deceit, often watched him sleep and wondered if God himself had turned his face away. The child lived, but not as the world should know him. He existed between two truths, too royal to live, too secret to die. And though his mother's sin had given him life, it also condemned him to the shadows, where history would forget him, yet never truly erase him. In the spring of 1531, confessionals across London were heavy with sin. The air of the city had changed. The king now sought to sever himself from Rome, and priests whispered of judgment. Yet none carried a secret as heavy as the one spoken by Anne Boleyn in the darkness of St. Dunstan's chapel one storm-bitten night. Father Edmund Tate, a quiet and learned cleric known for his discretion, was summoned to hear her confession in secrecy. The queen-to-be knelt before the iron grate, her breath trembling, her voice hushed yet burning with a kind of desperate faith. She spoke not of vanity or pride, but of blood, of a life born beyond holy sanction. "He lives," she said, her tone barely a whisper. "And God forgive me, I cannot repent what I have done." The priest's heart froze. He begged her to recant, to deny the words he had just heard, but she only wept. When she rose, she placed a golden rosary through the grate. "For his soul," she murmured. Then she left, her silks brushing the stone like the wings of a departing angel. 3 days later, Father Tate vanished. His parishioners found the church doors open and the confessional torn apart, as though a violent struggle had taken place. His body surfaced a week later near the wharf, mutilated, bound in chains, and weighted with stones. His tongue was missing. The Thames carried him like a dark omen through the city that had chosen silence over truth. Those who dared speak of it called it divine punishment. Others believed the king's agents had silenced him to protect Anne's growing power. Yet there were those few who whispered that it was Anne herself who had ordered it, not out of cruelty, but out of terror. A single priest could destroy her, her child, and all she had built. In Tudor England, survival demanded sins to bury other sins. But silence did not bring peace. The Archbishop of Canterbury, already wary of Anne's influence over Henry, began receiving anonymous messages sealed in wax. One letter bore only the words, "A queen cannot rise upon the grave of her own soul." Another contained the rosary Father Tate once held, its beads cracked and blackened as if scorched by unseen fire. The church bells of St. Dunstan's rang themselves one midnight, though no hand pulled the rope. Within the palace, Anne began to unravel. Witnesses reported her praying in solitude for hours, whispering in French to no one visible. She confessed again, this time to the Queen's chaplain, but her words made little sense. "He is not dead," she said. "He walks beneath the cross." The chaplain fled court within the month. When Henry asked her why she seemed distant, she smiled, the practiced smile of a woman masking torment. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "the church would not forgive what heaven already has." Henry laughed, misunderstanding her meaning. But to those who watched closely, Anne's laughter carried an edge of fear, a tremor that would never leave her again. The church had turned its face. Rome saw her as a serpent, England as a queen, and heaven as something in between. Yet the weight of one whispered confession had begun the slow, silent turning of the wheel, the same wheel that would grind her legacy, her lovers, and her child beneath it. Far from London's court, in the quiet fields of Essex, the hidden child grew under an ever-darkening sky. Lady Joan Parker, once Anne's loyal attendant, had become the boy's guardian in name and his warden in truth. Though she had once sworn before God to protect him, she now feared the very life she preserved. Each year deepened her guilt until it became a sickness of the soul. The house where they lived stood among withering oaks, its walls damp, its windows sealed against wandering eyes. By day, Thomas played by the riverbank, chasing birds and skipping stones. By night, he spoke of dreams no child should dream, of towers, of blades, of women with jeweled throats calling him by name. Joan tried to dismiss such talk as childish fancy, but when she looked into his eyes, she saw the same haunted intelligence that had once shone in Anne's. Strange misfortunes began to stir around them. The steward's wife miscarried. 2 of the horses were found dead without wound or struggle. Milk soured overnight. The villagers whispered that the child was cursed, that his laughter drew ravens from the woods. Joan forbade anyone from entering the property, but rumors are faster than walls. They called him the Black Heir of Boleyn. Dr. Henslow, the physician who had sheltered them since the beginning, grew uneasy. He warned Joan that their silence could not last forever. "The king's spies are everywhere," he told her, "and a boy who mirrors his father's face will not go unseen forever." But Joan was not ready to relinquish him. "He is not the king's son," she said through tears. "He is hers, and I promised her I would keep him safe." As if in answer to her defiance, sickness crept through the house. Servants complained of fevers and nightmares. One girl was found wandering barefoot in the frost, claiming she had seen a woman's figure in the orchard, pale, silent, her hands bloodstained from cradling something invisible. The following night, Thomas awoke screaming. Joan rushed to him and found his bedding soaked, though no wound marked him. "She came," he gasped. "She sang to me, but her face was wrong." The words chilled her more than the winter air. She pressed the child to her chest, whispering prayers she no longer believed in. Meanwhile at court, Anne Boleyn's health began to falter. Sleep abandoned her. Her appetite vanished. Courtiers remarked upon her sudden pallor and the way she would pause mid-sentence, as if hearing a sound none else could hear. She confided to her sister Mary that she dreamt of blood running down nursery walls, of a cradle rocking by itself in the dark. "He calls to me," she said once, trembling. "But I cannot answer. The walls are too thick." In Essex, Lady Joan wrote to her once more, the last letter she would ever send. "He grows strong, my lady, yet strange. The air changes when he cries. Sometimes I think the Lord himself keeps him from harm. But if the king should ever know, neither heaven nor earth will save us." The letter never reached its destination. It was intercepted, copied, and delivered not to Anne, but to Thomas Cromwell. From that moment, the shadows began to move closer. And though none yet knew it, the silence around Anne's secret was about to shatter in blood, confession, and fire. By 1534, the golden light that once surrounded Anne Boleyn had dimmed. The court that had once praised her wit and beauty now watched her with sharpened eyes, sensing a change in the king's favor. Henry's love, once blinding and absolute, had soured into restless irritation. He was a man who had defied Rome for her, who had torn apart a kingdom in her name, and yet she had failed to give him the one thing he demanded above all, a son. Anne's body had betrayed her. Miscarriages followed one after another, each one deeper than the last. The physicians offered comfort. The priests offered prayers. But Henry offered only silence, the dangerous kind that preceded wrath. He began to question whether God himself had cursed his second marriage. Cromwell, ever observant, fanned the coals of suspicion. He reminded the king of Anne's earlier years, her sudden disappearances, her periods of illness, her circle of confidants who had since vanished. He spoke of whispers, of unnamed rumors, of a child hidden in the country. Henry dismissed the notion with a bitter laugh. A child? From her? He scoffed. She would never dare. But that night, sleep refused him. He dreamt of a cradle overturned, of a serpent coiled within royal silk. The next morning, he summoned Cromwell in secret. "If such talk spreads again," he said, "I will have the truth torn from the tongues that speak it." Yet the seed of doubt had already been sown. At court, Anne felt the shift. The king's glances grew colder, his visits rarer. Her household servants were questioned, their chambers searched. The Lady Mary, Henry's daughter by Catherine, watched her stepmother's decline with quiet satisfaction. "The witch's crown slips," she was heard to whisper. Anne's enemies multiplied. A merchant's wife claimed to have seen a veiled woman carrying an infant from the palace years before. A stable boy swore that the Queen had once begged him to deliver a sealed letter to a physician in Essex. The evidence was thin, but in the court of Henry VIII, suspicion was enough to damn. Anne stood before her mirror, her reflection pale and unfamiliar. "They will not rest until I am undone," she said to her sister. "Even my own shadow accuses me." Yet within her heart, a deeper fear lingered that Henry somehow knew. That somewhere, by some divine cruelty, her secret had begun to crawl toward the light. When the rumor reached him again, this time whispered by an ambitious courtier, Henry erupted. His fury shook the very foundations of Whitehall. "Find the child," he roared. "If it exists, bring me proof." Servants fled, guards were sent into the countryside, and old acquaintances of Anne's were dragged in for questioning. But no proof emerged. Only silence. Only the uneasy faces of those who had once sworn loyalty to the Queen. Henry's rage turned inward, festering into disgust. He could not kill what he could not prove, not yet. Instead, he began to distance himself, turning his affections toward Jane Seymour, whose calm obedience was a balm to his wounded pride. Anne sensed the coming storm. She began to wear black more often, her laughter muted, her prayers constant. When asked if she feared the king's temper, she answered, "No man's anger frightens me as much as my own memories do." But fear was already circling her, not in the form of a sword, but of whispers. And whispers, in the Tudor court, were always fatal. In the winter of 1535, a quiet confession cracked the fragile surface of Anne's secret. It began far from the grandeur of Whitehall, in a modest chapel in Kent, where an aging midwife sought absolution before death. Her name was Alice Wenlock, a woman who had once served discreetly among noble families, delivering the hidden and the unwanted alike. Her trembling hands clutched the crucifix as she spoke to the parish priest. "I have carried a sin," she whispered. "A royal sin." The priest, believing it to be delusion, urged her to pray. But Alice insisted. She told of a night years earlier when she had been summoned in secrecy to Hever Castle, Anne Boleyn's ancestral home. The chamber was dimly lit, the windows sealed, the guards sworn to silence. The woman in labor was not yet queen, but she bore herself with regal terror. The child came before dawn, silent at first, then gasping, "A boy." Alice remembered the birthmark on his shoulder, shaped like a broken crescent. She had wrapped him in plain cloth, not royal linen. Before she left, Anne pressed a gold cross into her palm and whispered, "This child must never be known." The priest, realizing the gravity of what he had heard, took his confession straight to his superior. Within days, Cromwell was informed. To him, the tale was not madness, it was opportunity. He knew how dangerous the Queen's survival had become to his plans for England's reform. A rumor, properly placed, could finish what God and Henry had begun. Alice Wenlock was taken from her home under the guise of protection and brought to London. She was kept in a secluded room at Lambeth, questioned for days. The more she spoke, the more her story wove threads of dread around Anne's name. She described a wet nurse who had vanished, a servant who carried a swaddled bundle toward Dover, and a name, Thomas Culpeper, a distant relation in Kent who had once shown unusual loyalty to the Boleyns. Word reached Anne before the court could act. She froze upon hearing the name. Alice Wenlock. The woman was supposed to be long dead. Panic rippled beneath her composure. She sent frantic letters to those she trusted, urging them to leave England if they could. "The truth," she wrote in one, "is a flame that burns all who guard it." Meanwhile, Henry was shown a written record of the confession. His hands trembled as he read, though whether from rage or disbelief none could say. If it were true, it meant he had been deceived from the start, that the queen he had sacrificed a kingdom, afore had mocked him with another man's son. Anne was summoned. She denied everything with calm precision, her voice steady even as her eyes betrayed sleepless nights. "Lies," she said. "Lies whispered by those who crave my crown." But for Henry, denial was no longer enough. The seed of doubt had sprouted into hatred. Days later, Alice Wenlock was found dead in her chamber, her throat cut, her confession missing. Officially, it was suicide. Unofficially, it was the end of a witness. Yet her words had already spread through the corridors of power. The midwife's tale became court gossip, whispered by servants, repeated by nobles, and twisted by enemies. It no longer mattered if it was true. In the Tudor court, rumor became fact when it pleased the king. And as Anne looked upon Henry at their next meeting, his stare cold, void of affection, she understood. Her secret had become her death sentence. It began with a folded parchment, sealed in crimson wax, hidden beneath the false bottom of a carved casket. A servant of Cromwell's discovered it while stripping Anne's chambers of personal effects. The queen was already under scrutiny, accused of vanity, seduction, and treason. But what lay within that letter would damn her beyond redemption. It was written in Anne's unmistakable hand, delicate yet trembling, and addressed to someone unnamed. The salutation read only, "To the child born of my sin." The letter bore no date, no location, but the tone was unmistakably maternal, raw, fearful, and drenched in sorrow. "If you live to read this, know that your mother loved you beyond her salvation. You were born in secret, not for shame, but for mercy. The world would not forgive what heaven never forbade. My prayers are for your soul, though mine may be lost. The blood that made you will one day judge the blood that denied you." Cromwell read it twice, his eyes cold, his mind already turning. It did not matter whether the words were genuine. In the volatile politics of Henry's court, truth was a matter of convenience. The letter would serve its purpose. It would transform a queen into a heretic. He presented it to the king in private, unfolding the parchment with reverent precision. Henry's expression as he read shifted from disbelief to fury. His jaw clenched. His hand trembled. "A child?" he muttered. "She dares mock me with the ghost of a bastard?" Cromwell bowed deeply. "Your Majesty, the letter speaks of more than sin. It speaks of witchcraft, of divine punishment. The woman confesses to the unnatural." The word witchcraft was the final spark. To accuse Anne of adultery was one thing. To claim she had conjured a curse upon the royal bloodline was another. Henry's fury erupted like a storm. He smashed a goblet against the wall, red wine spilling like blood. "She will be stripped of every relic, every saint, every prayer she clings to. Let her face judgment as a sinner, not a queen." That night, guards entered Anne's private chapel. The air smelled of lavender and candle wax, remnants of her endless nights of prayer. They tore down the crucifix, shattered her rosary beads, and burned her prayer book in the courtyard below. Courtiers watched in silence, afraid to cross themselves. The flames reflected in their eyes like the fall of something divine. Anne watched from her chamber window, her hands clasped so tightly they bled. "They burn my faith," she whispered, "as they burned the truth." By dawn, she was confined under guard. Her ladies were dismissed, her jewels confiscated. A hush settled over the palace, the same kind of silence that preceded executions. Cromwell's men spoke of a trial being prepared, though no one doubted the outcome. The letter, once sealed in love, now served as her death warrant. Its ink, dark, almost reddish, seemed to shimmer when held to candlelight. Some swore it was written not in ink, but in blood. In the days that followed, whispers spread that Anne's ghostly sobs echoed from her abandoned chapel. The servants said the flames that had consumed her rosary refused to die, glowing faintly in the ashes for 3 nights. Whether miracle or curse, none could tell. But from that moment on, Henry saw not a wife or queen, only a specter of betrayal that would haunt his reign. On the morning of May 2, 1536, the Queen of England was led through the cold corridors of Whitehall toward a waiting barge on the Thames. The wind cut through her silken gown as though even the air refused to touch her. Anne Boleyn, once radiant and untouchable, now walked between 2 guards in morning black. The water glistened like steel beneath the gray sky, and in its reflection, she saw the face of a woman she no longer recognized. The Tower of London loomed ahead, not as a fortress of protection, but as the final threshold between the living and the condemned. It was the same tower that had once welcomed her as queen. Now it awaited her as executioner. When she stepped ashore, the lieutenant of the tower bowed low. "Madam," he said, his voice trembling, "I am commanded to receive you." Anne smiled faintly, a gesture more tragic than defiant. "Do not weep for me, sir," she whispered, "for I have done nothing to be ashamed of, yet everything to be punished for." They escorted her through the byward gate, past the chapel where queens once prayed for heirs. Her eyes lingered on the steps where the condemned had knelt before. Every stone seemed to remember. The air was thick with echoes of the dead, wives, traitors, nobles, ghosts of loyalty undone by politics. In her chamber at the Tower, Anne requested one mercy, to pray in the place where Elizabeth of York had once knelt before her own execution. The request was granted, though reluctantly. As she entered the dim chapel, she fell to her knees and murmured a single name under her breath, a name no one understood. Thomas. The guards exchanged uneasy glances. They assumed she prayed for a lover, yet the sound of the name carried something maternal, an ache too deep for scandal. None could know that Thomas was not a man, but the boy she had never held, the secret she had hidden beneath layers of sin and silence. Outside, the ravens gathered along the battlements, their wings black against the pale sky. The sentry said the birds never left the tower during executions, as if drawn by the scent of death, or by something older, darker. That night, as Anne prayed alone, a guard claimed he heard her voice rising and falling like a chant. When he dared to look through the keyhole, he swore he saw her kneeling before the altar, blood dripping from her palms as though her prayers themselves wounded her. By morning, the court's machinery was in motion. Cromwell's witnesses were ready. The accusations of adultery, witchcraft, and treason stacked like kindling for the fire. Henry remained silent, a silence colder than hate. When he spoke at last, it was to command that no plea for mercy be heard. Anne spent her final evening in quiet reflection. She wrote no letters, offered no defense. Only once did she break her composure, when the bells of St. Peter at Vincula rang in the distance. "Each toll," she said softly, "is for the soul of my child, who lives without a name." The next dawn would bring her sentence. As she lay upon her bed of straw, she whispered one final prayer. "If my blood must wash away my sin, then let it stain the house of Tudor forever." Outside, the ravens did not sleep. They waited. Far from London's iron towers, a boy was being carried through the mists of Essex under a moonless sky. He was 7 years old, small for his age, pale and unnervingly quiet. Wrapped in coarse wool, he did not cry or ask where he was being taken. He had been taught from his first breath that silence was his only protection. His name was Thomas, though no record bore it. He was the secret Anne had whispered in prayer, the sin she had buried in flesh and faith. Few knew he existed. Fewer still dared to keep him alive. Lady Shelton, his guardian since birth, had arranged for his escape when word reached her that Anne was imprisoned. Cromwell's men were already searching estates linked to the Queen, prying through midwives' homes and parish records. By dawn, the boy would vanish or die. The plan was desperate. Disguised as the bastard son of a minor noble killed in France, the child would be smuggled across the Channel under the protection of a Flemish merchant sympathetic to Anne's cause. They would claim he had plague in his blood to keep the curious away. His escort, a silent monk with ink-stained fingers, carried forged papers and a small chest of gold coins, all that remained of Anne's secret fortune. As the carriage rattled over the frost-hardened earth, Thomas pressed his hand against the window slit. Beyond it, the night moved like water. "Where is Mother?" he asked once. Lady Shelton's eyes filled, but she did not answer. By dawn, they reached the coast. The sea was black and violent, churning as though it knew the sin it would carry. They boarded a small vessel bound for Calais. The captain never learned the boy's name, only that those who asked too many questions did not live long enough to regret them. But the journey was cursed from its beginning. A week after landing in Flanders, the ship's crew fell ill. The merchant who sheltered the boy in Bruges died of sudden fever. The monk drowned in a canal. Death followed Thomas like a shadow, quiet and tireless. Each new guardian believed the child to be haunted, touched by something unholy that lingered from his mother's shame. In a convent near Antwerp, a nun once claimed she heard him whisper to himself in English, "The tower calls for me." When she entered his cell, she found him tracing circles in candle wax, shaping the outline of a Tudor rose. The wax bled red where his fingers pressed too hard. Word of the strange English child spread among merchants and spies. Some said he was a noble's orphan, others that he was the spawn of witchcraft. His resemblance to a man on the English throne grew more pronounced with each passing year. The same eyes, the same mouth. When he laughed, the sound carried Anne's timbre, bright, haunting, unforgettable. One winter evening, the cottage that sheltered him caught fire. The servants swore they saw a woman's shadow in the flames, her hand reaching for the boy before vanishing into smoke. Thomas survived, untouched by the blaze. Those who found him said he stood in the ashes whispering, "She's waiting." By then, rumors of Anne's execution had crossed the sea. Yet the boy never wept. Instead, he kept a single item hidden beneath his tunic, a rosary bead, cracked and blackened, said to have been saved from his mother's chapel the night it burned. Wherever he went, the scent of smoke and blood seemed to follow. The morning of May 19, 1536, was unnaturally still. The air over the Tower of London hung heavy, as though the world itself awaited something it could not bear to witness. Within the Queen's lodgings, Anne Boleyn rose before sunrise. She had not slept. Her hair, once the envy of courtiers, was now hidden beneath a simple linen coif. Her gown was gray damask, unadorned. She refused jewels. "I will go to God as He made me," she had said. Outside, the scaffold was being prepared on Tower Green, a small wooden platform draped in black. The executioner had come from Calais, chosen for his precision, his blade known for mercy and speed. But mercy for Anne had long since departed England. She prayed one last time in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula. Her voice was soft, almost detached, as if she spoke not to heaven but to something or someone beyond it. When she rose, she looked at the lieutenant and smiled faintly. "I have little fear of death," she said, "for it will end the sorrow that began before I was born." By mid-morning, the crowd had gathered nobles, soldiers, even ladies who once knelt before her. They stood in uneasy silence. The king was not present. He hunted in Windsor that day, unwilling to witness the death of the woman who had once remade his kingdom. Anne stepped onto the scaffold with calm that unnerved even her executioner. She spoke clearly, her words recorded by trembling witnesses. "I pray God save the king, for he is a good and gentle master." Then her eyes shifted toward the pale clouds above. "He will return," she murmured, almost inaudibly. "He will return." Some believed she spoke of Christ. Others whispered she spoke of her son, the one whose existence was denied, whose name was never written. As the French swordsman prepared his stance, Anne knelt, tucking her skirt neatly beneath her knees. Her lips moved silently, forming the words of a final prayer. The crowd held its breath. The blade fell, clean, silent, final. But those nearest swore her lips still moved even after her head was severed. 2 guards dropped their halberds and fled, claiming her eyes turned toward the sky before closing. Her body was placed hastily in an old arrow chest, too small for a queen. Henry ordered her buried without ceremony. No name was carved upon the coffin, no prayers recited. Yet when night fell, a single candle burned at the chapel door. A nun from the nearby priory, known only as Sister Catherine, entered alone. With a small blade, she scratched one word into the wood above Anne's heart: Mother. For weeks after her death, strange happenings were whispered among the tower's watch. The ravens would not leave the green. Each dawn, their cries echoed through the courtyard like the wailing of a child. One guard swore he heard a lullaby drifting through the fog, the same melody Anne once sang to her daughter Elizabeth. When Henry was told of these tales, he laughed and ordered silence. Yet even he could not sleep without seeing her face in his dreams, her eyes wide, her lips whispering that same phrase, "He will return." The curse had begun to breathe. Years slipped quietly through the cracks of England's memory. The tower was cleaned, the scaffold dismantled, the name Anne Boleyn spoken only in whispers. But across the narrow sea, in the bustling port of Antwerp, the ghost of that forbidden name began to stir again. In a modest house off the Mayor, a pale young man lived under the name Thomas Gower. He was slender, with dark hair that curled like his mother's, and eyes so strikingly familiar that English merchants who saw him swore they had met him before, in some long-forgotten courtly portrait. He spoke flawless English, yet bore a soft French accent. His manners were refined beyond his supposed birth. He bowed as a courtier, quoted scripture like a scholar, and carried himself like one who had been taught to hide his lineage beneath humility. Those who befriended him noticed strange habits. He avoided mirrors. He never attended church on Sundays, but would walk the docks at dawn, murmuring Latin prayers no priest could identify. Children claimed he fed the ravens there, whispering in their ears as though delivering messages. Rumors spread swiftly through Antwerp's English quarter. Some said he was a runaway noble bastard. Others whispered the word that turned every ear to ice: Tudor, by 1545. An English agent named Robert Wakefield sent a report to London warning of a youth bearing resemblance to Her Grace, the late Queen Anne. The letter, intercepted by the Bishop of Winchester, vanished into the vaults of Whitehall. A week later, Wakefield drowned in the Scheldt. His body was recovered, his tongue missing. Still, the boy's name, or rather his lack of one, continued to haunt diplomats and traitors alike. They spoke of his predictions. He said England's peace would rot from within, that kings would fall, one by one, until a red-haired queen ruled alone and wept in a palace of mirrors. None could explain how he knew what he did. In the spring of 1546, witnesses saw him feverish and raving in his rented room. He claimed to hear his mother's voice calling him from across the sea. "She stands by the water," he whispered, "with blood in her hair and a crown of thorns." When his landlady entered the next morning, the bed was empty. The window stood open, curtains fluttering like wings. No burial, no record, no trace. Yet, weeks later, a merchant vessel bound for Calais reported an uncanny sight at dawn: a figure walking the shoreline, barefoot, the hem of his cloak soaked in red. When approached, he lifted his head. The captain swore, under oath, that he saw Anne Boleyn's eyes staring back at him from the boy's face. Word of this reached London, though the court dismissed it as superstition. Henry VIII was dying by then, plagued by festering wounds and sleepless nights. When told of the story, he demanded silence. "Let the sea keep what it has taken," he said, voice trembling. But the silence did not last. Long after the boy's disappearance, servants in the royal chambers whispered of strange things: an empty cradle rocking in the night, and a child's laughter echoing through the corridors where Anne once walked. Some said the curse had found its voice. Henry VIII's later years were a slow descent into madness. His body, once powerful and commanding, decayed from within. Ulcers festered on his legs. His sleep was haunted by cries only he could hear. Courtiers swore they heard him mutter her name, Anne, in the dead of night. Others whispered that the king had begun speaking to shadows, as though someone unseen stood beside his bed. When storms struck over Whitehall, the candles in his chambers extinguished on their own. His dogs howled and scratched at the doors. One morning, a servant found the king's rosary beads shattered across the floor, each bead cracked like bone. Henry claimed a woman had stood at the foot of his bed, holding a Tudor rose dripping with blood. "She asked for her son," he said, his voice trembling like an old man's confession. The court physicians blamed fever. But the whispers spread. The curse of Anne Boleyn had awakened. Within years, those who had played a hand in her downfall met grim fates. Thomas Cromwell was executed, accused of treason by the same king he had once served so faithfully. The men who had signed Anne's death warrant died in disgrace, madness, or silence. And Henry's wives, each in their own way, carried echoes of the curse. One beheaded, one dead in childbirth, one vanished into sorrow. When Henry died in 1547, his coffin leaked blood onto the floor of St. George's Chapel. Witnesses claimed a dog entered the church and licked it clean, a dark omen, they said, for the Tudor line. But the curse did not die with him. Years later, Queen Elizabeth I rose to the throne, Anne's living daughter, proud, brilliant, untouchable. Yet even she could not escape the haunting shadow of her mother's secret. Those closest to Elizabeth recorded nights when she would wake screaming, claiming she saw a boy standing in the corner of her chamber. He never spoke. He only held a Tudor rose, its petals bruised and dripping with red. At first, her advisors dismissed it as exhaustion. But the Queen grew pale, restless. In her private prayer book, among verses of triumph and glory, one entry remained hidden, written in her own hand. The child walks still. He bears her eyes. Historians would later call these the midnight writings, fragments found after Elizabeth's death, half burned, half preserved, ink smeared by tears. Some believe she had learned the truth, that her mother's secret son had lived and died, cursed by the silence that protected her throne. And perhaps that silence was the true curse. Not witchcraft, not vengeance, but the weight of a truth so dangerous that it twisted the destiny of a dynasty. A secret buried in the heart of England's golden age, waiting to be unearthed by time. Even now, centuries later, scholars and seekers return to the ruins of the tower, tracing every stone, every hidden symbol, every scratch on Anne's cell wall. Some claim, if you listen closely beneath the chapel floor, you can hear faint knocking, like the rhythm of a mother's heartbeat. Others say, when the wind passes through the tower at dusk, it carries her final words, not of hatred, but of mourning. He will return. And somewhere, beyond the reach of history, the boy of no name waits still, the blood of kings, the ghost of a secret too dark to die.